and that is, what exactly is the state of the patent monetization business? I'll let you guys answer in whatever order you choose. Bob, go. You're the one who's had the longest, most distinguished career.
It ain't what it used to be. In 1996, Rob Pressman and I started a two-guy firm focusing 100% on monetization and compensation piece of the action. We had some extraordinarily good years. It ain't the way it used to be. I would say that today, if you look at a patent monetization opportunity, assume you got a good patent, it's gone through all the right analyses and stuff like that, it's worth 20% of what it was worth 10 years ago, and I don't need to bore you guys with the cases and the statutory reasons why that is the case. So what's the state of the monetization business? It's down by 80%. Wyland, which is one of the 2 or 3 largest, most successful monetization firms, they're headquartered in Ottawa, so not in the country, in the world. Wyland, about a year ago, changed its name to Quarterhill, started acquiring actual operating businesses, mostly with patents, mostly in the IoT space, and to some extent, they haven't gotten out of the assertion business, but de-emphasizing the assertion business to create a better story for the investment community and to create a better story when they're in court. So what's the state of the monetization business? If you are 40 years old and looking to make a hell of a lot of money, maybe you better go back to school or take a different direction. This ain't the place to go today.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree with that. I mean, for those not familiar with Lot Network, we are 178 companies who have kind of formed a trade association that have pledged that if any of their assets fall in the hands of an assertion entity, the community members get an automatic free license. And this was born out of the results of what's happening with the value of IP, I think, over the last 5 or 6 years. Certainly, as you were discussing, as Ashley mentioned, these headwinds, I think as a result, collateral damage, if you will, of the Apple versus Samsung versus Google versus Motorola wars is that a lot of uncertainty has been introduced into the IP system. If you're a patent holder, you have to wonder, is my patent valid? Is it statutory now in view of 101 in Alice? If I assert that patent, I can immediately get an IPR, and is it going to survive what some call the patent office death squad? If I do assert it and I get a verdict of infringement, am I going to get an injunction? I mean, if Apple can't get an injunction against Samsung, who am I to get an injunction? And then what damages? If you're left with getting damages, what's the amount of my damages award when judges seem to be reluctant to have crisp rules on calculating that? And all this uncertainty has certainly devalued assets, I think. And if you look at any data like AST puts out, they track what's the average selling price of assets. It's certainly probably 1/20th, maybe 1/10th of what it was just 5-6 years ago, in the high water mark of 2011. So certainly all this uncertainty has certainly, I think, hurt the value of assets, and that's kind of where we're at today.
Russell.
I think both the first panel and these comments highlight the fact that if you want to look at the licensing industry, it's the ability to monetize IP has dropped precipitously over the last 5, 6, 10 years. I think starting looking originally at eBay decision and injunctions. But the question, another part of the question is, the water has gone down for everybody. So perhaps what was originally the intent of some of the reform to deal with, I see it behind us, troll, labeling a certain behavior in the monetizing space as bad. And trying to deal with that issue has affected everybody, whether you're a legitimate licensing operation like Wyland or others that have very valuable IP that advance industry, or if you're a manufacturing company and you're dealing with a cross license with others, or if you're in the area of picking up patents and trying to assert them broadly against lots of operating companies, mom and pop shops, whatever. It's gone down for everybody, and I think it's gone down more than it should have as the strategy to tackle the bad behavior has affected everybody, and I think that overshoot is part of what we heard about in the first panel on where the U.S. is relative to other countries and whether we're going down or going to reverse that and go back up in strength.
So I'm going to follow-up question before turning to the question of, there's a question I think we should get to, which is, so what would we do to change the current ecosystem such that it was more favorable to the IP ecosystem? Before we get to there, it might make sense to think about, well, how did we get to where we are? So if panelists seem to agree that we're in a world in which IP has been devalued and it's very hard to monetize patents, why are we in that world as opposed to some other world? Robert.
I've been saying this for the last 25 years. No chief patent counsel ever got a raise, a promotion, a bonus, or a pat on the ass from the CEO for saying, hey, here's somebody who's alleging that a patent, that we're infringing a patent, and by God, they're right, this patent is strong, the infringement case is strong, let's write them out a big fat check and get this out of the way. I mean, that's been my life. InterDigital and most of these so-called trolls, Wyland, started out with technology presented in standards organizations agreeing to the FRAND standards. Then they couldn't compete with a product and had nothing left but the patents, and they went around. I did it with InterDigital, I did it with a whole bunch of other clients, and the big companies didn't want to take licenses, and so what are you going to do? You're going to sue them. You got to give you got an obligation to your shareholders, and you're off and running. And to me, that's the whole story, and it's been distorted, and the distortion is affecting the ability of early stage companies to get financing. Maybe you know more about the specifics than I, but I've certainly been reading that venture capital funding in the United States in the last few years has been down by a factor of about 20%. How much of that is or isn't related to lack of respect toward patents that we're seeing, I don't know, but to me that's a very important consideration that often gets ignored. And I'll say one last thing and shut up. One of my great talents in life is long answers to short questions, and you'll have to forgive me. But to me, the real problem is, how do you get to the media, okay? Because the media is the area, the judges are influenced by the media, the legislatures are influenced by the media. You're not going to be able to get directly to the legislatures to get things changed legislatively because of, well, I don't even need to tell you, you know why. And so it's about how do you get to the media, and to me the story is that what we're doing right now, we've decimated the patent system so much that we're undercutting the entrepreneurial spirit, or maybe not the spirit, but the ability to take and harness that spirit in startups and new industries and new businesses.
Other thoughts on the question of why is it we're in a world in which it's difficult to monetize patents? What happened?
Yeah, I think it just goes to the uncertainty that's been introduced into the system. No one knows. It's difficult now to decide, is it worth buying these assets? What's my return on my investment? What's the likely outcome? I think it's just a question of the unpredictability of the outcome.
So let me ask a follow-up question, because I'm going to Russell and then I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Go ahead.
Well, I hesitate to repeat what I said a minute ago, but I was the chief patent counsel at Micron Technology before I went to the Patent and Trademark Office, and we went back into the early 90s, and Micron needed, at least from the C-suite perspective, to reduce or eliminate the need for writing those checks from anybody asserting their patents against the company. So, of course, there was money that was allocated to affect the legislature. Everything from, and it was all focused on how do we reduce either the chance of having to write that check or even being hailed into court. What can we do to tip the scale in our favor? So, of course, there was a desire to reduce the ability to get injunctions and shut us down. There was a desire to have damages allocated really on not the entire product, but split it out onto what's covered by the patent venue. And I think the broader audience, the broader IP community didn't really understand the desire and momentum back then to affect both the judiciary and the legislation. And we are late to the game, if you will. So a lot of what we're talking about came about because of those issues dealing with the bottom line that was affecting companies.
So I want to follow on your answer. So the answer is the world changed because firms lobbied, and they lobbied in lots of different ways, and they lobbied hard.
Yes.
Robert.
Technology changed. That's a big part of it. When I started out with InterDigital in '92, there were a handful of patents in smartphones. And today there are thousands of patents and technologies and patents in smartphones. And owners of the patents are seeking compensation. So you get into this much more complicated and potentially expensive dynamic. And we were looking for a 5% royalty on a 2% smartphone, on a $200 smartphone in 1992, 93. Obviously, in today's world, if you took that number and kept multiplying it or anything remotely close to it, the consumer would wind up paying a lot more. So you wind up in this conflict as technology evolved and multiplied, and people were looking at the value of patents in the 92 or whatever perspective. Everything changed, and that pushed the courts and the legislatures toward trying to compensate. And it was perfectly obvious when the eBay decision came down that was kind of the death knell. You knew once the Supreme Court decided eBay, 15 years ago now, that more bad stuff was coming down the line. You just didn't know when. So the basic moral was get the money and run, because today it's a different ballgame.
So I'll jump in here with on this topic of tech. So there's two answers now. One is there's lobbying by firms, mostly on the buy side of patents, and the other is technology. Maybe technology changed. So on the sell side of patents, the ability to appropriate some of the returns from the surplus created in new products like a smartphone changed. So these are the two answers. We've done a study, the we being myself, Alexander Galechevich, and Lou Zaretsky. I've done a study that's available on the web, entire data set available on the web, on actually how much it is that implementers pay for all the patent rights in a smartphone. So we've looked at every stage in the value chain of creating a smartphone and what the total royalty, the so-called royalty stack is. Since 2007 to the present, it is 3.5% of the value of the smartphone. It is stunningly low. No matter how we torture the data, we can't get it above about 5.5%. So the world in which, the claim was, right, well, everybody wants their 5%. Well, everybody wants 5%. In fact, I want to raise 2%. But that doesn't mean that my dean believes I'm holding him up. Well, actually, he believes that. But this is a difficult audience.
It's a very, very serious crowd.
It's a very serious, but everybody wants, right? Everybody wants 5%. But in fact, almost nobody at least since 2007, gets anywhere near that. And most firms, like Wyland, for example, get such a thin slice of this. I think the Wyland's total income is around, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, it's around $200 million a year. $200 million
In a good year.
$425 billion a year industry is a tiny, tiny slice. And most of that 200 million comes from things other than smartphones. So I want to sort of give you guys a chance to respond to think about this. Of the two possible answers we've got, one, it's lobbying by implementers. The other is it's changes in technology that have allowed the technology development companies to grab more of the surplus created by new products. Where do you guys come down in terms of the weight of the two things that were happening?
I think, to his point, I think the convergence of technology is being underestimated in this. I mean, certainly if you look at the automobile industry and the amount of technology that they're incorporating into an automobile today versus just 5 years ago, consumers are not going to pay twice as much for the car. But yet more IP is being incorporated into the product, and as a result, the value of any particular piece of the IP is continually being diluted. I would almost put it at 50-50. Half of it's because of the lobbying efforts, half of it is just the amount of technology and the amount of patents are involved. Any one patent is just getting diluted.
You know, I don't think it's binary. I mean, this is a soup we're talking. You know, what created the lobbying efforts in the first place? Part of it is the complexity of the technology and how many more patents affecting a given product. And I come from the semiconductor space, so I can think of, you know, everything from the chemistry to the circuitry to the methods of operation and interaction, and the patents, you know, become so enormous, the pool that you're facing, that there's no way to have a clearance of operation, and so then you're always going to be stepping on somebody's toes with infringement, and people are going to come to you. So it creates the problem that creates the lobbying. I don't think we should underestimate the effect of, you know, labeling bad behavior with a name like troll, and there have been some bad actors out there, and some of the bad actors have really accelerated that by going after, you know, Main Street mom and pop fax machine users, etc., that get Congress's attention. Those efforts, those lobbying efforts, were very effective when it took a turn like that. And I want to say, you know, a shout out to the PTO, and I realize that, you know, educating K through 12 is not going to solve the problem that we're facing today, and there are a lot of different prongs at the PTO dealing with education and outreach in a lot of different areas besides K through 12. And it's a large agency, and it's got reasonable budget. You know, but budgets are limited, and PTO can't solve all of these education problems. But we do have a lack of education across the entire spectrum that doesn't appreciate what intellectual property actually does for the country and for industry, and the narrative of trolls and bad behavior and extortion have really overshadowed that.
But as everybody here knows, John Paul Kidd.
I'm interested in what the panel has to say about setting up IP standards so that those who project in the patent office and collecting comments to set up some guidelines for international patent licensing executive society. Canada has started a number of initiatives for licensing, conduct in the boardroom, brokerage. So it seems that could possibly be a way to both educate and to get to the issue of what is good and bad behavior, and possibly remove some uncertainty. Or maybe it's just a waste of time. So what do you guys think?
So, but before we can answer the question, is your question, sir, on a related topic?
It's a little different.
Okay, so I'm going to hold your question, and I'm going to take the liberty as moderator to sort of try to, is your question related to this question?
No, it's related to the current topic.
Okay, then let's go to your question, and then we'll come back here.
Yeah, I went to a presentation a couple of years back where a person read a newspaper article, and it sounded exactly like the anti-rhetoric or patent rhetoric of today, but it was actually from the 1890s. And I think it occurred again and again with the sewing machine wars, and it's just continuous throughout history. And I think Russ hit it on the head when he said this time the people that went after the small business owners, you know, with the 80,000 letters asking for, you know, $5,000 and we'll go away, we won't sue you in court. That might have been one of the real differences this time around that caused Congress to act and the public to become outraged over patents.
Well,
There's
Sir,
an old
does your question
bromide.
relate to this, or is it also a separate? It's separate.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll come back.
the comment on that, though, would be, yeah, okay, if there were lawyers going around suing everybody about false marking of patents that were no longer enforced, and the statute at the time is that you had to pay $50 for every one of those. And what did Congress do? They just passed a reasonable law that took care of that particular bad actor instead of gutting the whole damn system.
I agree. There's an old bromide. If you put an ounce of sewage in a barrel of wine, you got a barrel of sewage. And basically, that troll situation, which I think is a legitimate concern, the frivolous marginal patent against a bunch of little guys, but I've never seen that. I mean, I've been doing this for 25 years, and every damn patent that I've ever seen asserted has gone through $50,000 or $100,000 worth of due diligence, and the law firms, if they're going to do it on a partially contingent basis, do their own due diligence, and nobody goes into the game unless they have a reasonable assurance that there's a reasonable probability of succeeding. But kind of back to your question, to me there are four issues. Everybody knows them. Validity, infringement, damages, and injunction, okay? On the royalty stacking, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that concern. You can't get 5% times 100 basic patents anymore, so the damage model has to modify. How well it modifies and adapts remains to be seen, but I'm sympathetic to the modification. But the validity, infringement, and injunction issues basically, to me, remain out there. And one thing I don't know is the PTAB, what percentage of the PTAB's invalidity decisions are based on prior art not previously presented to the patent office? I don't know the answer. Does anybody know the answer to that one? Because I know you guys have all been involved in those. Pardon? Yeah. So there's always prior art out there. I mean, the patent office can't possibly do the perfect job. So if you take out that prior art that the patent office didn't have a chance to find, then the rest of it seems to me that they probably look pretty decent. And the PTAB ain't so bad. And as long as I'm talking, I've got another quarrel about the PTAB. Once you go through the procedure, because we just did in a case that went to trial in April, and you win, okay? The defendants initiated 2 IPRs with respect to the 2 asserted patents. We won at the petition stage, threw them out. They asked for reconsideration. We won at the reconsideration stage. Threw out a lot of prior art. Big company defended against a little company plaintiff that had attempted to license and got ripped off. Go to trial. And the judge says, PTAB's not an Article III court. I don't have to respect it. In motions in limine, excluded any reference to the decision of the PTAB. So even after we won, okay, we won, and we couldn't use the fact that we won at trial. Now, fortunately, the jury was a very astute jury, and we won a trial and got a $50 million verdict. So, thank you.
So, Ken and then Russell.
So I was just going to, I know you're playing traffic cop with all the comments, but I want to address one question about what role does the government might have in fixing this issue. I think, at least I'm fortunate that I get to hear the opinions of my member companies, and the consensus seems to be there's very little that the government can do at this point. Any additional legislative reform or even judicial reform to try to tweak the patent system is very likely to upset the balance. If you did something with venue, you're going to hurt the small inventors, or whether on damages, you're going to hurt the universities. So it feels like the system is at a point where, and it's almost at the point where my member companies don't want any more legislative reform because they're afraid it's going to have some undesired consequence. And as to the question of royalty stacking or standard setting, I just fear that the rate of technology adoption and how things are changing is much faster than any government agency could keep up. I almost think that the marketplace itself, the companies, the participants, the users, and the patent holders need to resolve this rather than having the government do it.
Russell.
As an analogy, if we were talking about real estate development as opposed to patents, and the real estate market accelerated where, if you will, of course it brings a lot more people into the market and looking to make money, and you're going to have individuals that want to be a slumlord, if you will, and extort lots of money for you know, a place where you don't want to live. And the government can step in and put in rent limits and everything else to try to deal with that one bad actor, but you have the result, I believe, that we see in the IP space, in that you've reduced the desire for building the new apartment buildings. You've reduced the desire to invest new capital and be in the market, because you've driven the entire market down. And I think, you know, the more government tries to step in here and control behavior, I think there's going to be a lot more negative repercussions from that. I'm glad to hear that you know, the perception right now is enough is enough. We don't want any more legislation. With respect to the PTAB and the IPR proceedings, I'm kind of, you know, having just left the PTO, I'm going to defend them in that the IPR process, I think, had good intentions when it came out with the AIA. And I think it's a good check, because I know with the number of examiners that we have at the agency, that there is always going to be patents that issue that perhaps were not examined with the skill level that they should have been, whether it's because the examiner was in over their head, or the examiner was having a family crisis, bad behavior on the applicant's part, whatever the case might be. There's always going to be patents that issue that have a question, a cloud over them as to whether they should have issued, and we should have a process for it. However, the burden of proof, the way that the claims are interpreted, the ability to bring cases that basically are challenging on art that was already before the office, a lot of those issues need to be addressed, and are slowly being addressed through decisions at the PTAB. So I'll stop.
There are several hands up. This gentleman back here is, sir.
Hi, I'm with your friendly inventor-owned non-practicing entity. So I do have one observation I'd like to share with the group. Not so much a question, but really an observation. This is probably the nth meeting I've come to where up on the board will be something like identifying good and bad behaviors. I would ask for this group to consider, because this is a group of thinkers, and it's a pleasure, frankly, to be here. I would ask this group to consider exactly what bad behaviors are we talking about, and whose behavior is it? Every place I go, it's my behavior. It's the NPE's behavior. Folks, I invite you to go on the licensing call with me. I have been told to have relations with myself in about 20 different languages, and in ways that, frankly, I'm an ingenious guy I'd never considered. And then I go and sit down and talk with my friendly government representatives, and all I want to hear, they want to talk about is the bad actors, the bad patents, the bad actors, the bad actors. I'm sorry, folks. No. Whether it's Wyland, whether it's us, you don't make money suing people for $5,000. You don't. And when you're talking about the market cap of these poor victims being $1 trillion, and the amount of money being made on the products that these people make, and your comment about 3.5%, frankly, I was shocked it was that high. I really want to get this group thinking about, at least let's talk about balancing the behaviors. There's a lot to be done in that side.
So I see another question here, but before we get to there, let me bring some other facts to the table. So the 3.5% is not just PAEs, it's the entire licensing ecosystem, including companies like Microsoft, which earns about $1 billion a year for its patents on Android. So you'd have to now claim that Microsoft is a PAE. I'll leave it to others to decide whether there is or isn't. If you just take the universe of publicly traded firms identified by RPS as PAEs. Their total, I've studied with Noel Maurer of George Washington University on this, the total revenues of those firms is about $1.7 billion per year. If you then add in a reasonable upper bound estimate of what they impose in terms of litigation costs on the firms they sue, it's about another 800 million, so you get to about $2.5 billion. If you then add in what the likely amount is from privately held PAEs, if you imagine that you took intellectual ventures, you take their revenues and you double that, you can push this number up, the total cost, to about $4 billion. And then you have to ask the question, $4 billion, is it a big number or a little number? Here's one way to scale it. Americans spent $7 billion last year on Halloween. 365 million of which was pet costumes. The total revenues of the tech sector, if you just take like the big 5 tech companies alone, it's going to run to over $600 billion. These are, unless there is, and it's a question, unless there is an awful lot of lawsuits against mom and pop shops, and the evidence doesn't seem to indicate that, because being a PE turns out to be a high risk investment. You can see it in the data, in the share prices of so-called PAEs. Going back to 2000, this has always been a high-risk business. It doesn't suggest that's what's going on. So let me just take this back to the panel for a minute, because you guys have touched on sort of issues about lobbying and about how a narrative gets created, and what's the real sort of, what are the real issues here? And I'm kind of nug-headed. How is it that a narrative got created that there are bad behaviors? As professionals in this business, this is not just rhetorical. I'm a professor. I've never negotiated a damn thing except my own salary. So, how much bad behavior have you actually seen as a percentage of all behavior? So I guess I'm going to rephrase it this way. There are always bad actors. Keanu Reeves is one of them. The question is, of the actors we see, how big is the Keanu Reeves problem in the IP ecosystem? Thoughts on this?
Pet costumes are I don't want to disparage pet costumes or Keanu Reeves, but it's a very small percent, if it exists at all, that really that fall into that very far end of the spectrum, in my opinion. But just because it's a small amount doesn't mean that it hasn't got a lot of traction, and that it's been very effective. Brad mentioned a minute ago, we've seen throughout history, we've seen issues like this right after the Civil War and expansion across the country of technology and local manufacturing. We saw lots of lawsuits, and we saw Congress respond to that. But this has been exceptionally well tractioned when you've got Supreme Court justice. I heard Justice Breyer state during oral argument that the Patent Office has issued millions of invalid patents. I mean, when it's gotten to that level of traction, it doesn't matter whether it's based on one bad behavior or 10% or 20. Debating how much bad behavior, I think, is not going to get us to the answer of how do we counter that now.
Well,
Ken and then Robert.
Yeah, I think it's a question of who you're talking to. I mean, in lot, about 2/3 of our members are the large, big companies, large IP holders. They're dealing with patent assertion entities who are well-resourced, well-capitalized, high-quality, high-risk assets. But about 1/3 of our members are startup companies who make less than $10 million in revenue. And every one of our startups joined LOT because they were approached by somebody who gave them the shakedown story. And they were just in the middle of trying to form their business, and they got the shakedown threat for $20, $15, $20,000, whatever it might be, and they were just panicked and they've joined our community. So there is a real risk of these shakedown threats that are out there. The big companies, on the other hand, they should be able to handle it. It's not the bad actors. They're just dealing this from an IP risk management. What's the cost of litigation and settlement?
Bob?
3 points. First of all, I can tell you in 1992 when I was at InterDigital, we were trying to license the big telecom companies, and it was a totally different universe. We had the same kind of pushback and the same kind of problems that you have today, so I don't know that anything much has changed. Whatever they want to blame it on, to me, again, it's my old bromide that I already gave to you. Number two, and with all due respect to my telepathic fellow Brooklynite, Jerry Holtzman, yeah, part of the bad behavior is what's commonly called today efficient infringement, where it's a well-known strategy for defending against patents no matter what. Screw them. Go ahead and infringe, and you know once you spend $5 or $6 million, which ain't much, on defending the case, then you're either going to win or you're going to be able to beat down whatever their demands are, and if you can't do it at trial, you'll do it on appeal. So that's number two. The other one is, I can tell you, I've been in this business for 30 years in terms of the assertion part of the business, and I have never met, and I called up Jim Skippin the other day, who's the CEO of InterDigital, of Wyland, and I said, do you know who's behind these little cases, these little marginal patents, with the fax machine and, pay me $1,000. He said, I don't know. I don't know either. I haven't seen any of those companies, who they are, where they are, but to me, it's a drop in the bucket, and yet the PR firms take a drop in the bucket and make it seem like a tidal wave in the ocean.
So I see many hands here, and I'm going to start with this gentleman. I'm going to take 3 comments, questions, and then give the panelists an opportunity to respond. But I'm going to take 3 and then ask you guys to be brief in your comments and questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Just really quick. Does anybody know what happened to Jawbone? I assume everybody in this room knows who Jawbone is, right? But what happened to him? Okay?
Failed.
Yeah, they went bankrupt. But what are they doing with their IP? They pivoted that into another company called Jawbone Health, which they couldn't have done if they hadn't generated the IP in the first place, the patents in particular. Anybody in this room know what happened to Quickie? This was a pretty big Silicon Valley company. They just sold 500 patents to Samsung, one of the most savvy patenting companies in the world, bar none. All right? Now, if people in this room don't necessarily know that, what's the problem? And why would we expect that anybody else outside this room would actually care? So what are we going to do to talk about how those startup companies were able to extend the lives of their companies and were able to extend the value to their shareholders and investors by taking advantage of a strong patent portfolio?
Could have sworn I said that about 15 minutes ago.
Okay, well, I'm going to take several questions, and then we're going to, I saw Bo Hayden had a hand up. Bo Hayden.
Yeah, I was going to say that we have this kind of balancing act here where we want to have more patent monetization. We want to have more patent monetization, and then we say that, well, it doesn't happen because we have all this rhetoric against things, but we wouldn't have all these in the market actors, defensive aggregators like Lot wouldn't be able to survive if there wasn't actors out there doing this, I would assume. So either there is a real threat from these superfluous actors, or the actual act of defensive aggregation is actually thwarting patent monetization by people that have actual legitimate claims. It's one of the two.
I saw another hand here, this gentleman here, behind you here on the aisle.
Mike Pellegrino. So many things here. First, on the value question, I'm chairing the LES standards on valuation, so anybody who had that question earlier, come see me on that. Jerry asked a question about good and bad behavior. So I do a lot of data analytics, so I'll give you some examples. This is real stuff. So if you want to identify where it happens in our system, it happens at all levels. It happens at the PTO when an examiner comes out with 9 different discrete pieces of prior art across 30 years and says there's no hindsight bias there. It happens every time an attorney who's an advocate files an IDS on something. Oh, I've never seen this before, but then I pull up every other IDS that they've ever filed and found out that they're lying. You know, that's bad behavior. It's Google who files a suppression on every single patent application that they file. It's a pure defensive play. They don't care about the foreign rights. I get it. There's nothing wrong with what they're doing, but they're doing that to kick the can down the road on the disclosure. So there are elements of this that are rampant throughout the system. You just need to know where to look. The data's there. And on the 5% issue, I do a lot of valuation. I disappoint a lot of clients because it's always higher than, in their mind, than what it actually is. And it's about 80% of the early stage clients I disappoint. And it's not 5%. That's filled with, there's a whole bunch of what we call autocorrelation errors in that data set. So your real value on your inventions is probably a lot less than what you think. And when you change your expectations on what that is, you're never going to get to the point of litigation. Most of the IP that transacts in the U.S. never goes to court. And you can tell that by looking at the assignment database. So in some ways, we're dealing with already a fringe element, i.e. patents that are litigated. In another fringe element, patents that are held by NPEs. I mean, we're talking about 2,000 assets out of 10 million. Like I said, too many things to say here. I'd love your feedback on any of it.
I'm going to, because we're running low on time, yes? I'm going to give the panelists the opportunity to address these issues, and then we put one last quick question to them. So
I'll try and say this as concisely as possible. I think a lot of people confuse, what the initial purpose of patents are. And there are those in the industry, those who say that patents should only be given to practicing companies that are successful and in the marketplace and hire people, et cetera. That's one thought process. The other is, we're talking about companies that have invested, or even single inventors that have invested their time and energy to create something. Whether the company fails or not, this is still an asset that should have a residual value, and those individuals, those companies, those inventors should be able to be rewarded for their contribution, not judged on whether they are currently a practicing entity, because that's just not possible. And unfortunately, all of those have been lumped in with the small percent of bad actors, whatever that is.
And of course, the big companies have gotten into the act through what's called privateering, in which big companies assign large blocks of patents to patent assertion entities and take a piece of the action. So they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they're participating in the process in order to be able to extract value from otherwise unused pieces of their portfolio, or against competitors that they don't want to sue directly, so they assign the patents to Wyland or Acacia, whoever they do it to so they're not in the middle of the equation. And yet, they, on the other hand, argue out of the other side of their mouth. So, but to me, sorry for being repetitive about this, but it all boils down, in my simple mind, to two things. The media, which to me is the most approachable to us, the most approachable segment of society that has some influence in this area. And I believe that they have a lot of influence on the judges because they read the papers too. And I think we have to get to the media and explain this good and bad behavior situation, and the point that this gentleman made about Jawbone, but it's the same point about InterDigital, and it's the same point about Wyland. And Acacia started out as a venture capital firm, and then wound up, when the 2000 bubble burst, with nothing but companies with patents. And educate the media that this is a much more complex equation than this, and that the really bad guys are the real minority, and the majority deserve to be treated fairly. And you got to do it in the media. And I don't know how you do it in the media, and I assume Bruce Berman has prepared, will give us the answer before the day is out. And I'm looking forward to it, Bruce.
Ken.
Just a final thought, just to clear the air, Lott believes in a strong patent system. We believe in innovation. We believe strong patents are necessary to drive innovation. To Bo's point, I think Bo's absolutely right. We have 800,000 assets are committed to the lot obligation. You wouldn't have these large companies making this commitment if they didn't perceive they were getting a benefit and value from that. And to your point, lot members are actually solving the privateering problem. The lot members are not allowed to privateer against each other because they've made this commitment. So if you're looking for some good behavior, joining lot and driving innovation might be to do it. One last creative idea on how to solve for this, maybe to walk away, is I know that people assume quality has something to do with the monetization aspect or patent assertion entities. I'm a firm believer that if companies, those who can pay should be forced to pay. So one suggestion might be with the IPR system, maybe if you were to dramatically increase the cost of doing the IPR or filing the IPR, and then because those defendants can afford it, and then using those funds back into the patent office to drive quality so that even better patents issue. So if you made IPRs 10x more expensive, use those funds to improve the quality of patents. That might help instill more certainty into the system.
So this jumped to the last question I wanted to ask, and I'm going to ask for 1 minute. And I want to give Russell and Bob 30 seconds because Ken raised the thing I wanted to get to, which is like, what's the thing you would do, right? And so it's, okay, let's make IPRs more expensive. That would be a helpful adjustment to this ecosystem. So I want to start with Russell and then Bob, and then I'm going to give Ken the last word on this, 30 seconds each. What would you do to make this ecosystem work better than it's currently working? You had just one suggestion, either on the business model end or on the regulation judicial end.
Bob, you want to jump in first? Because I need a second to think about this, the one answer.
Again, to me, it all boils down to educating the judges, educating the legislatures to what the realities are. Do you get a bunch of business reporters who write about this stuff from the Times, the Journal? You tell me you get them to seduce them to some place with Hawaii or something like that, something they can't say no to, so you know you can get yourself a captive audience, and then bring out a bunch of entrepreneurs, the guys who started the businesses, whose technology was appropriated by the big companies, and who would have wound up with nothing but for one or another vehicle for getting their just desserts for their hard work.
So I would like to see the legislature, the USPTO, the judiciary all recognize that the pendulum has swung too far. That addressing whatever issue that they perceive that they were addressing, we've resulted in overkill, and it needs to be brought back. I don't think you need to repeal everything, but I think there needs to be an awakening moment in across the spectrum that we've hurt the U.S., we've hurt the economy, we've hurt our competitiveness, and we need to bring back some of the reforms that have happened. Which one you start with, how you get there, the education, that's a big, perhaps we'll get the answer by the end of the day.
Ken, very briefly to follow on your earlier comment about the IPR.
Last thought, I would suggest maybe we listen more to the pharma industry. I think what has happened the last 5 years to patents is because of the high-tech industry trying to address the patent assertion problem. In doing so, they've also hurt pharma. And so maybe high-tech and pharma need to figure out a kiss and make up and find some common ground and try to get a stronger patent system.
Thank you, gentlemen. This was I learned a lot from this panel. I hope the audience did as well, and I want to thank you all. Thank you.